Hey everybody, I'm Sam Gross from electricbikereport.com, and today we're taking a look at the Radio Flyer M880 electric bike. So this is one of the first electric bikes from the company best known for its little red wagons, and this bike is being dubbed as their mid-tail electric cargo bike, which means it's a cargo bike, but just a little bit shorter. So it still has a 300-pound payload capacity. It's got a plenty strong 500-watt rear hub motor and a very long range 720 watt-hour battery. So let's dive into it and see what this bike is capable of. So this bike is for your kind of everyday average city commuter. It's a class 2 electric bike, meaning it's got a throttle and pedal assistance that's going to max out at 20 miles an hour. And most importantly, especially because of this kind of mid-tail cargo bike designation, it's able to carry quite a lot. So the review model that we have has these two baskets, front and rear, and we'll dive into those a little bit more later, but these are two accessories. And on the rear rack in particular, you can load this thing up with different accessories, including things like the Yep Maxi child seat for those who want to take their kids to preschool or to daycare or wherever you're going. You can really put a lot of things on this bike. So this bike is going to suit anyone kind of in that kind of urban environment. It fits bike paths very, very well. It's not the strongest hill climber, and we'll get into that more a little bit later, but on flat city roads, it's got a very nice and relaxed power profile that feels very safe and very controlled and very stable. So as far as motors go, this is a pretty standard 500-watt rear hub unit, and it's not the torquiest. So Radio Flyer seems to have really put a priority on creating a very nice and stable and safe holistic bike. They were really focused on making something that's going to carry a lot of weight, be comfortable, handle well, and feel really nice when you're riding it. So if you're looking at this bike thinking it's going to be some sort of torque monster or speed monster, it's really not. That doesn't mean that this motor isn't enough. It feels really nice, it's got a good amount of acceleration, but I do have one gripe, and it's not really with the motor itself, it's more about how they've tuned it. So Radio Flyer has given it a very nice, very smooth acceleration profile, and a lot of companies will do that, especially at the low speeds, kind of like when you're taking off from a stop sign or something like that. But this bike, oh hey dog. She is. And that's kind of to prevent the bike from jerking out from underneath you. And Radio Flyer has done a really nice job of that on this bike, but they've actually kept that profile all the way through the power curve. So it even happens at the higher speeds. So what I've noticed, and this bike does really well on paths, it's where I've ridden it the most, is actually when you're trying to pass someone on the path at a higher rate of speed. So think at like 17 to 20 miles an hour. If you're not using the throttle and you're just pedaling, you've hit the brakes because you come up behind somebody and you're going to pedal and you're coming into oncoming traffic to try and pass them, the bike takes a little bit to get up to speed. It doesn't take a minute for the motor to kick on. This isn't an issue with that cadence sensor actually noticing that you're pedaling again. It's more that it just rolls on the power so slowly, and this bike actually weighs a pretty good amount. It takes some oomph to get it back up to speed again. One way I've worked around this is if you just tap the throttle, that actually engages the acceleration quite a bit quicker, gets you around that person very quickly. So it's a relatively easy fix, but it is one thing to keep in mind about this bike. Other than that, I've really enjoyed the motor. But one thing we do with these bikes, because hill climbing is always going to be everyone's first question when they're buying an e-bike. How does it climb hills? How does it flatten hills? So we put these bikes through a hill test. We've got a hill here locally, it's called Hellhole, ranges between 12 and 15%. So it is extremely steep, and I'd argue it's actually far steeper than you'd actually normally take a bike like this. You're going to be hard pressed to find a hill that steep in a city, but we do it twice. One of these tests is going to be on the throttle only, and the next test is on max PIS. So that's PIS 5 in this bike's case. It's the maximum pedal assist setting. So let's see how this bike does. All right, so we're going to do the first of our 2 hill climb tests here at Hellhole. It's a pretty steep hill. And we're going to go first on throttle only and see what this bike's got without any help from me. The hill's got a little bit of a run up. into it, and this is a Class 2 bike. So I always like to see if we can get close to that Class 2 max by this turn, which we did. Hello. So this isn't the torquiest bike I've ever tested, but it doesn't do too bad. But we can tell that it's not the torquiest by it's struggling right now. We're down to 8 miles an hour. This is one of the steepest sections of Hole, and oh man, I'm a little worried if we're gonna make it on this. So we're down 4.5 miles an hour. One thing I'll really give this bike credit for is the motor is dead silent, even right now, when it is probably under some of the highest stress we've put it under. Oh man, we're down to 3 miles an hour. We might be calling it. If I dip below 3, I'm gonna have to start balancing, and that's not super good. I'm already having to balance a little bit. But the motor is not making any noise. There's no vibrations, which is actually really impressive considering this is a sub $2,000 bike. And a lot of these more affordable commuters, especially the rear hub drive bikes that we've tested recently, we've been getting quite a bit of noise, quite a bit of vibration on this hill, and this thing's just smooth as can be. Starting to ramp back up to speed a little bit on a flatter section. We're gonna go right back into a steep spot, and we've got no momentum going in here, so it's gonna be real tough on it. Oh, come on, buddy, you got it. And that's it. Unfortunately, the Radio Flyer under just throttle didn't make it up our hill. But keep in mind, this hill is at about 12%. Whoa, there's the edge. So it's really steep. I'm not sure if the GoPro catches it, or even if our drone that's flying above me catches it very well, but this is a really steep hill. So back down to see what it does on pedal assist 5. All right, we're pausing here at the bottom before our PAS 5 hill test, just so my GPS can pick up in the bottom of this canyon and Bryce can get himself situated on the drone. But so we're gonna give this hill another go. Our first hill test was a dud, unfortunately, on this bike. We didn't quite make it up on throttle only, but we're gonna try it again on PAS 5 with the help of my legs. And this is a bike that's really liked the help of pedaling. It's really appreciated my pedaling. So I don't think we're gonna have too much issue getting up here, but let's give it one more shot. Hit go on the GPS, and away we go. There's the motor kicking on. So this bike has a pretty light power delivery. It's very tame. It is a Class 2 bike, so there it was hitting 20 miles an hour with the motor kicking off. Back on now that we're on our hill. I'm just gonna start cycling through the gears. So it's already doing way better with the help of my pedaling. And I'm really not having to put that much into it. One of the nice things about this bike is it does put you in a good pedaling position. Even with me being 6'1", I'm able to get the seat high enough and the cockpit in a good enough area that I can get a full leg extension. And yeah, this thing is struggling far less with the help of my legs. And again, it's just so smooth, like impressively smooth, even when we're really taxing the motor. So this steep pitch I'm about to hit, that actually bested the bike on throttle only on our previous lap up this. Kicks up to about 16-15%. Here's a flat section, gain some speed. Ooh, they're painting some lines. And here we are coming close to the top. And here is the finish line. It's a pretty good PAS 5 result. on behalf of the Radio Flyer. Not too bad. I can't tell you how impressed I am with how smooth the motor was going up that. That was good. So we've just wrapped up our hill test, and keep in mind this is a 12 to 15% hill. It's a third of a mile long. That's a pretty long hill, and it's very, very steep. But on throttle only, this bike actually didn't complete the hill, didn't quite have enough torque to make it up. But on the max PAS setting, it did it in 1 minute and 31 seconds at 11.9 mile per hour average, which is a pretty respectable result, especially considering the fact that it didn't clear the hill on throttle only, and that it actually is a fairly heavy bike. But I'm gonna really stress that this bike shouldn't be knocked for not making it up the hill with just a throttle. That hill is incredibly steep. One of the reasons we've picked it is because it is a little bit kind of an exaggeration. It's like an extreme use case scenario of what these e-bikes are really ever gonna be faced against, especially a bike like this that is really most at home on kind of flatter roads, an urban environment, on smooth rolling bike paths. It has done a good job. On the max PAS setting, I was actually really impressed on how well it responded to my pedaling. One thing I've noticed on this bike through all of my testing is it really does appreciate pedaling. It's not an e-bike that's just gonna do all of the work for you. And this Shimano Tourney drivetrain, it's a 7-speed drivetrain. I was really impressed. It did a nice job. I'm not always the biggest fan, and this is just a personal preference on my part. The shifter does perform fine. I'm not a biggest fan of that Tourney overbar shifter. It's got its shifter pod actually on top of the handlebar instead of below it. You know, I'm a mountain biker just by my own preference, and I'm used to shifting below the handlebar with my thumb. This makes you wrap it up above it. That's fine. A lot of people are going to appreciate that, and it does allow you to have a little window on the very top. But all in, this drivetrain did do very well, and it is a lot of the reason this bike was able to clear that kind of extremely steep and longer than average hill. So the Radio Flyer M880 has a 48 volt, 15 amp hour battery, which gives the bike 720 watt hours worth of energy to use, which with a 500 watt rear hub motor, especially one that is as mellow as this one, that gave this bike a really incredible range. So we do 2 range tests on this bike. One, which is typically done at the lowest pedal assist setting, but we've tweaked that actually for this bike, and I'll get into that in a second. And then we do a second one at the maximum assist level, so in this bike's case, it's PAS 5. So we typically will test these bikes for the long range tests at the lowest pedal assist level, but after testing several dozen now of these 5 PAS level affordable e-bikes, we've really noticed that PAS 1, more often than not, really doesn't give you much by way of assist, and it's making these bikes go a really, really, really long time. So this bike is another example of that. So PAS 1 really only kicks in on hills. So we have notched up on what power level we're testing on to PAS 2, and that is really the first assist level that we kind of noticed that it was an e-bike. So on PAS 2, this bike went for 60.73 miles, which even though it wasn't on PAS 1, that is huge. That is a really long range. And then on PAS 5, this bike went for 36.65 miles, which again, really impressive range at a high battery assist level. So for this bike's use case, just kind of urban city commuting or bike path riding, you're really going to be hard pressed to run this thing into the ground. It will probably outlast your legs. So something we noticed about this bike on both of our range tests is it does something that quite a few e-bikes actually do, and as the battery level dropped, the amount of assist you were getting, even though you're not changing the assist level, actually begins to go down. And I like to think of it as these bikes kind of try to die with dignity a little bit. They want to get you home as best as they can. So that's part of the reason why these bikes went so long in their range tests. And it is something to keep in mind, especially if you're looking to do a longer ride. So if you go out for thinking you're gonna do 36 miles on PAS 5, holding 20 miles an hour the whole time, at the end of that ride, you're probably gonna notice that power starting to drop off. Another thing that happened was this bike's battery indicator. So it uses an icon, looks like a battery, and it's got 5 bars inside of it, with the final bar having a little E signifying empty in it. So when I set on my range test, I thought that meant that when the bike was finally empty, that final bar would disappear. And that's not what happened to me. So I actually lost 4 bars worth of battery, and then the bike died. So I thought I had a little bit more time, which, you know, after 36 miles or 60 miles even on the low assist setting, I was ready for it to die, frankly. So another thing to keep in mind about this bike is this bike's display has kind of an optimistic battery readout where it will drop a bar under high loads, and then as soon as you let off and it kind of has a moment to catch up with itself, it will regain that bar. So it kind of bounces back and forth. And I found that this kind of makes it a little bit hard to really know where you're at in the bike's battery life. So things to keep in mind. So here's what we've got going on in the cockpit of the Radio Flyer M880. So on the left side here, you've got a display. So this is a fairly basic unit. Remember, this is a sub $2,000 bike. We are seeing some more kind of fancy units, full color units, stuff sitting in the center of the handlebars here, but this really has all you need. So you've got a power button, a plus and a minus button to cycle through your pedal assist settings. Right here, it's going to show you your pedal assistance. This is for speed. This is your odometer, and there's even ways to cycle through different screens on here. And then right here is your battery indicator. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the Shimano Tourney 7-speed gear shifter. So this is the gear shifter I was talking about that me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of just because of its positioning on the bars. I think there are actually a lot of people who are going to like where this is in the bars. It's got a nice gear display here that shows you which gear you're in. This is how you shift into an easier gear, and this button right here is how you shift into a harder gear. And then all the way over to the right, you have got your twist throttle, which the bike is on right now, so it's actually going to jump forward. But yeah, that's really what you got going on. And then, oh yeah, here's the bonus. So that's the handlebars. So to test how the bike performs in each of its 5 pedal assistance levels, we do what we call a circuit test, which is a lap around this 1 mile course. It's about the closest thing we can get to a closed course here at EBR. There's no stop signs, 4 corners, and 1 very small hill. And we do this test 6 times. So the first test is in no pedal assistance, so just my legs, and then we bump up the power level on each consecutive lap after that until we end in the max PAS level. So this bike did very nicely in this test. So something that we always watch for is just nice measured jumps in speed between each of the different pedal assistance levels. So it actually rolls very well just on its own with no motor. It's got nice kind of smooth, narrower tires, so there's not much resistance against the bike as it moves. So it rolled at just under 13 miles an hour with no motor assistance. And then we saw a jump of about 1 mile to 1.5 miles an hour in between each of the different pedal assistance levels, all the way up to that class 2 20 mile an hour max. And all in, it performed really nicely. This test also doubles kind of as a nice little handling test, a high-speed handling test, because we are taking these corners at close to 20 miles an hour. And it was really nice. I actually really enjoyed these slick, semi-fat tires. They're about 3 inches, maybe a little bit less than 3 inches, but it was a great bike. It rode well. So one thing Radio Flyer has done really nicely with this bike is they've leaned in quite a bit actually to the idea that this is just a smaller cargo bike. So remember, they call this their mid-tail cargo bike. So Radio Flyer does make a full-size bike. This one's just a little bit smaller. It's got the wheelbase of a traditional bike, so it handles a little bit easier, but it still has a 300-pound payload capacity. And one of the ways they've achieved that is by building the rear rack into the frame. It's got this really cool truss style. One of the side effects to that, which we'll get into in the handling section, is that it makes the ride a little bit rougher, but you can carry so much on the back end of this bike. So these racks that are on here, they're actually aftermarket accessories that Radio Flyer sent to test with the bike, but I've really kind of fallen in love with them a little bit, especially the ones in the front. They have these nice zippered pockets, and then in the front, they actually have places for you to stick bottles. It's like these little elastic straps, but it actually worked really, really nicely. And you know, if you're confident riding with one hand, it makes it really easy to access your phone, a jacket, some water bottles, whatever you might be wanting to store in this bike. But this thing has been really nicely as a good mid-tail commuter cargo bike. In addition to that, you're also getting some integrated lights, front and rear, plastic full coverage fenders. I've been really impressed with how it's performed so well. So to get an idea of how well this bike slows down, we put this bike through a braking test. We put all of the bikes we test through a braking test. And how we do this is we set up a series of cones, and each cone is 5 feet apart. We run the bike at it at 20 miles an hour, 5 times, slam on the brakes as hard as we can, then take the average of those 5 stopping distances. And I'm very curious to see how this bike performs, because we don't have an exact weight of how much this bike weighs, but like all cargo bikes, even though this is a mid-tail, smaller cargo bike, it's fairly heavy. It's also got mechanical disc brakes, which mechanicals are not quite as good as their hydraulic counterparts, but they still do a pretty good job of slowing down, so I'm very curious to see how this thing performs. So we just finished up the braking portion of our testing of the Radio Flyer M880, and I have to say I'm really surprised with how well this thing performed. Came to a stop on an average of 12 feet and 2 inches, which is a pretty good result thinking about how heavy this bike is and the fact that it only has mechanical disc brakes. We'd mentioned before that hydraulic disc brakes are usually the more powerful of the two types of disc brakes you can have, but these mechanicals have stopped very, very quickly, especially considering how much this bike weighs. Something I've noticed about this bike, which is different with some of the other bikes I've brake tested, is it did very little skidding. And I chalk that up, one, to the fact that those mechanical disc brakes give a very kind of, we call it brake modulation, where you can really control how much power you're putting into the brakes by how hard you're squeezing the levers. In addition to that, it's got these big CST semi-slick tires that are about 3 inches wide. And that big contact patch, combined with that brake modulation, I was able to keep this bike very controlled coming to a stop. And it actually kind of surprised me with how well it slowed down. So another kind of notch in the belt for the Radio Flyer M880. So when we're typically talking about a cargo bike, we're talking about a bike with a longer wheelbase. It's going to be quite a bit heavier than your typical e-bike, and it's going to have some side effects that go along with those two things that affect the handling. It's going to steer a little bit slower. It's maybe going to feel a little unstable at low speeds, especially when it's loaded down. But this bike, being a mid-tail cargo bike, you really are getting the same wheelbase as a typical e-bike, but you've got the carrying capacity, but just a smaller carrying space. So this bike actually handles really, really nicely. And I chalk that up, one, to it's got a very neutral riding position. You're a little bit upright, you're not stretched out, you're not too cramped. It's just very nice and comfortable. And I'm 6'1", and I was able to get this bike to raise the seat high enough that my legs were extending fully. So it was very comfortable and efficient pedaling position. This bike actually rolls really well without any sort of motor assistance. I was able to just kind of ride it around at 14 miles an hour without really, breaking too much of a sweat. But a lot of the bike's really nice handling characteristics, I actually chalk up to the tires it's got on. It's got these CST tires on them. They're a little bit wider, but they're slick. They're designed for street riding. This isn't one of those bikes that's got fat tires with knobs that, when you ride it on asphalt, it's got a lot of rolling resistance. You can kind of feel it pushing against your hands when you're steering. This bike has a really nice steering profile. It handles corners very nicely, and I found it to be very stable and comfortable. So all in, I've been really impressed with the Radio Flyer M880's performance. It's a very stable, very safe feeling, very fun and very capable e-bike. I did have some gripes with how the rear hub motor delivered power, especially at the higher speeds, and with how the pedal assistance levels delivered power at kind of their lower assistance levels. But all in, this bike has been really great. Radio Flyer has done a great job of balancing that kind of utilitarian aspect of being able to carry kids to preschool, carry things back from grocery stores, and also just having a really fun, really nice riding bike that you can take out on the weekends. I've had a really fun time reviewing this bike, and if you've liked this video, be sure to give us a like below and subscribe to our channel. And if you want to know more about the Radio Flyer M880, be sure to check out a link in the description below this video for a more in-depth review of the bike. So for Electric Bike Report, I'm Sam Gross. Thanks for watching.